From the Land Grant University in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, this is the closing market report. It is the 19th day of April 2024. I'm Extinction's Todd Gleason. Coming up in this half hour, we'll talk about the commodity markets with Mike Zuzolo. He's at globalcomresearch.com out of Atchison, Kansas, and Eric Snodgrass will be here from Nutrient Ag Solutions and Agrable to discuss the weather forecast. Oh, and if you can stay with us for the whole hour, you'll hear all of our Commodity Week program with our panelists this week, including Merrill Crowley, Wayne Nelson, and Kurt Kimmel. If not, you can hear it right now on our website at willag.org, willag.org. Look for Commodity Week there or in your favorite podcast applications.
Todd Gleason services are made available to WILL by University of Illinois Extension.
May corn for the day settled at $4.33 1/2. That was up 6 3/4 of a cent. July 6 3/4 higher as well. The settlement price there at $4.43, and December futures at $4.66 1/4, up 6 1/4 cents. Soybeans at $11.50 1/2, up 16 1/4. July $11.65 3/4, 16 3/4 higher, and the November at $11.61, up 11 3/4 of a cent. Soybean meal at $3.43.70, up 5.70 for the day, and the bean oil at $44.38, 26 cents higher. Wheat futures soft red July at $5.66 3/4, up 13 3/4, and the hard red in the July at $5.83, up 7 3/4 of a cent. Live cattle futures for the day finished the lead option 30 cents higher. The feeder cattle down 80 cents, and lean hogs were up $2.12. Crude oil for the afternoon at $82.34, up 24 cents, and gasoline just about unchanged at $2.69 a gallon. Mike Zuzolo, globalcomresearch.com out of Atchison, Kansas, now joins us to take a look at what's happened in Chicago for the day and the week both. Hi, Mike. Thanks for being with us. Let's get right to it. Can you give me your overview of what took place at the CME Group this week?
Yeah, I think this was an excellent week and kind of a clinic, if you will, Todd, of a bookended trade where we started the week with food and fuel leading the market lower. I think primarily due to the heightened U.S.-China trade frictions and the talk of increasing steel tariffs against China, tripling them is what I'm hearing at this point, versus current levels, and this being the Biden administration coming out with that. And so we had the gold remain at a near record high. We had the copper hit 2-year highs, but we saw the crude oil and the wheat really take a hard beating in the early part of the week, and it really did a lot of chart damage in the shorter term charts, and corn and beans willingly followed, I think, those two. Now, fast forward to Friday's trade, and with the fresh strike by Israel, a limited strike on Iran, and we saw a very volatile shift in the Globex trade. Wheat and crude oil, two of the biggest movers to the upside in Globex trade. I think soft red wheat had a 22-cent range when it was all said and done, or close to it, and crude oil was upwards of $86 a barrel at one point, about $4 off that high, though, by the time we got to Friday mid-session. But I think that food and fuel commodity negativity was quickly dispelled with this geopolitical tension gearing up again, and you saw the corn and beans react very, very quickly. And I think that's the heart of what we're dealing with as we get planted in most of one part of the Corn Belt, some of another part of the Corn Belt, and very little in the Eastern Corn Belt.
Are you of a mind that this is a temporary function? And I know this is a difficult question to answer probably, or is it more of a longer term scare that the trade will be dealing with?
If you took away algorithmic trading and the AI aspect of our markets, the dollar, I think, while it would probably still be a safe haven, I don't think it'd be as big a safe haven as it is right now, and weighing on the prices of commodities so much. And we saw that directly in the Brazilian currency against the soybeans, being hit very hard with a 13-month low in the Brazilian currency on Thursday against the U.S. dollar, and the beans making fresh contract lows in some cases. So I'm of the view that this should be a geopolitical risk premium that's pushed into gold, pushed into crude oil, some pushed into U.S. bonds, not a lot pushed into the dollar. and therefore the commodities should have more of a risk premium in them. But that's just not how we trade nowadays, and that's why the funds are so short at this stage and not yet feeling uncomfortable about their short positions, it seems.
What do you think it will take for them to be uncomfortable?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to what we've talked about for the better part of a year, Todd. I think the Federal Reserve and China are the two biggest things. Those are our demand leaders, investment demand with the Fed and physical demand with China. What we needed to see, I think, Friday, or the building blocks on Friday, would have been new weekly lows in the U.S. dollar, new weekly highs in the soft red wheat and the crude oil. And then we probably could have seen the second half of April come around real nicely for the corn and beans, because we do have supply demand issues for the corn, especially in South America. And the E15 news this week really didn't get traded much at all. And we really took a lot of premium out of the price in the futures when EPA pushed that back to 2025. And we're seeing it in the cash market, but we're not seeing it in futures. So I would say a beginning point would be a shift in momentum to get the funds nervous, and that would start with new lows in the dollar, new highs in the wheat and the crude.
To preview just a little bit of Commodity Week, it wasn't exactly a bearish Commodity Week, but it wasn't really friendly. I suppose you're kind of in that same vein. The three of them thought that May might be a much better month than April. What are your thoughts here?
I'm a little bit of a contrarian on that because I'm nervous about USDA giving us fresh supply demand numbers for 24-25. And if they come in with a lower South American crop for beans, it's not going to mean much. And depending on how much they come in lower for corn, I think it could mean quite a bit more. But because they're putting 24-25 numbers out next month, I think it really does push us back into more of a weather scenario. Are we delayed on corn planting and therefore resurrect an acreage issue, and whether we can get optimal yields? I think May is more about the weather. I hear what they're saying, and I think that's where the June time period comes into play, where if we're tight in supplies and corn and beans, South American prices should be really finding some support off of that. We're seeing support in Russia. Crop was lowered by Sovicon today for Russia. Ukraine is still battling drone strikes in Odessa. Their prices are getting elevated on the export front. So the export cash prices are what really matters to me, whether it's May or June. And I like the corn the most because I see the wheat tight in supplies, and I think the corn crop is shrinking both in Argentina and Brazil right now.
Is your mind that the black box trade does not recognize yet what USDA might put into the supply and demand tables that come out for the 24-25 crop? I mean, they've been there, but not in an official capacity. And does that make much of a difference with those algorithms?
I really think that the algorithmic trading, and I don't run algorithms, so this is all based upon analysis and research of looking at papers and how algorithms trade. Weather is a big deal in commodities this time of year for algos. That's why I bring it up. And I think the second thing that really comes to my mind is the idea that if we're going to new 2024 highs in the dollar, do we really care about supply? And if we're having worse tensions with China because of an election year, do we really care that much about supply? And that seems to be the trend that we've been on.
Okay. Thank you much.
You bet, sir. Great questions as usual, Todd. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's Mike Zuzolo. He's at globalcomresearch.com out of Atchison, Kansas. Hey, now that you're in the tractor cab, it'll be easy enough for you to tune in to our daily agricultural programming from Illinois Public Media. Make sure you do that. But if you miss it, it would be great if you caught up on it on a podcast. That's easy enough to do. Just a Bluetooth from your phone right to the radio in the tractor cab. But you need to subscribe to the podcast first. You can do that on our website at willag.org and then hit that podcast tab. There you'll find players for the Closing Market Report Commodity Week and the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy podcast. Each of them has a subscribe button on them where you can then just hit Apple or Spotify or any of the other available podcast applications there. If you've already got a podcast application you like to use on your phone, just search out the Closing Market Report or Commodity Week and subscribe today. In today's agricultural news, U.S. EPA has announced it will allow 15% ethanol blends to be sold in 8 Midwestern states this summer. E15 is a higher ethanol blend and often marketed as unleaded 88, says Monty Shaw, who's the executive director of the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association.
Huge win for consumers and retailers. It's going to allow us to continue to sell E15 and no interruption. It's selling for 15, 20 cents a gallon less, more ethanol, more renewable, more homegrown, and lower cost. So we've seen sales really skyrocket lately, and so we didn't want to see that come off the market.
Under current policy, which EPA today waived, E15, again unleaded 88 at the fuel pump, is not supposed to be sold during the summer months. However, the agency has the authority to temporarily waive these requirements to address pressing concerns. The war in Ukraine, disruptions to key trade routes, and inflation have raised these kinds of issues. On a related note, EPA's announcement today comes on the heels of an EPA approval in February of a petition from 8 Midwestern governors allowing their states to sell E15, but since that decision is not effective until the summer of 2025, EPA opted to use its additional authority for this summer. Unleaded 88, by the way, can be used in 2001 and newer vehicles. Let's stay in Washington, D.C., where Finance Committee senators of both parties stepped up attacks on the White House's trade policy, or some said the lack of one, especially in agriculture. Republican Senator Mike Crapo complained that Catherine Tai, USTR, or U.S. Trade Representative, has not been doing trade deals, while others around the planet have.
Australia and New Zealand each negotiated free trade agreements with Thailand. And since then, demand for premium U.S. beef fell by 30% because our cattlemen face a 50% tariff while those two partners face none.
And from the other side of the aisle, Senate Ag Chair Democrat Debbie Stabenow was a bit more muted, but still echoed a similar call for free trade deals.
I know there are a number of agriculture stakeholders that sent you a letter earlier this week urging you to commit to an aggressive agriculture trade agenda. So important that we have those markets. We need those markets, and we need the trade agreements.
For her part, USTR's Catherine Tai earlier in her tenure called FTAs an outdated 20th century tool. She now more openly underscores the political importance to the president of organized labor, stating, "We don't want to play Americans against Americans or sectors against sectors." And that's a look at today's agricultural news. Let's check the weather forecast now with Eric Snodgrass. He's from Nutrient Ag Solutions and Agrable. Hi, Eric. Thank you for being with us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on.
Let's begin with the near-term forecast for farmers wanting to get their planters in the field across the Midwest this weekend and through next week.
Yeah, so this weekend is we're going to have to be just a little careful just because of how cold we'll get in the mornings. So we're going to get a frost that'll probably get as far south as I-72 and patchy south of there as we work our way through this weekend. So high pressure is in place, cold conditions are here, and it's going to last us until, some point early next week. But what'll be interesting is after that moves out and we do get a little bit of a drier stretch, there'll be small chances of precipitation, but nothing that kind of wipes you out for a long time. But what's interesting after that is we go back into this kind of look in the atmosphere where troughs of low pressure hit California, Arizona, and New Mexico. And what that means is as we play to the end of this month and then start to get into April, it's not as though planting windows are going to be tight and non-existent, but it does look like we're going to have good April storm systems. And that kind of brings me back to what we just had, right? So yesterday, I was actually in Arizona watching from a distance, but keeping an eye on those storms that came through. It seems like they come through every time I leave. So maybe, Todd, if we get into a drought situation, you let me know. I'll just leave the state and it'll probably storm. But anyway, yeah, those storms came through. And if you were able to avoid some of the damaging aspects, we had some wind, a couple of reports of tornadoes in Illinois, and some hail. But, man, it was a good drink of water that we needed to get this soil. So I'll tell you this about the near term. Cold this weekend. We start to break away and get some decent heat back in the system next week. It comes with the risk of some more storms, but that's spring, right? I mean, we find those windows when they're there, and it just seems like we're getting to a typical spring thunderstorm type pattern once we get past this weekend's cold conditions.
If you look forward into the summer months, is there anything new that we should discuss?
Yeah, so the Climate Prediction Center released their new long-range forecast, and it's very complementary to what's been already given to us from the European model and another group of models, which is called the NMME, the National Multi-Model Ensemble. And here's the big idea. All of the models have a different view on how quickly we transition to La Nina. Nearly all of them do get to some stage of La Nina by the time we get into late fall, but some of the models are very aggressive on it. And here's the idea. There's drought in Mexico right now. It's quite dry in parts of the Western Plains. Kansas is kind of an epicenter of drought right now. And there's still drought issues despite recent rains in the Western Corn Belt. So what are these models doing? Well, throughout summer, just month by month, they're taking drought from the west and pushing it east, such that by the time we get into the heart of July and August, it seems that the epicenter of those really dry conditions are going to be sitting over like Kansas City. Now, this is the second month in a row that they've kept that very, general outlook on what the precipitation pattern is going to be. So I was just talking with a friend yesterday who were flying back from Tucson. He says, what if just give me a call. What do you think it's going to be on summer in the Midwest? And I said, honestly, at this point, I think we get through it hot and stormy, with most of our warmth coming in hotter overnight lows, not necessarily scorching hot daytime temperatures, but I think it's going to be hot and stormy to start. And if there's risk on drought, it creeps in from the west with time, meaning that the southern plains is where you want to watch right now in terms of where there's currently drought. And that's kind of the narrative that I think I've landed on here at this point in late April. And of course, that's going to change, Todd, but that's what I'm thinking right now.
All right. So this week we've been talking about analog years. I've got a lot that have been thrown out. Have you come up with one?
I've come up with dozens, it feels like. But every time you go to investigate a specific analog year, you find these little nuances to it that just make it not fit. But I'll be honest with you, and I've kind of put this in several of my forecasts this week. I've been using the phrase renting space in my brain. And the year that's been just stuck in my head has been 2020. Now, that's a bit odd because the winter of 19 into 20 did not have, a big El Nino event. We just had slightly warmer than normal ocean temperatures. And then as we got into summer of 2020, we saw a weak La Nina build. And to be honest with you, before I even looked, I would have just, if you would have said, hey, Eric, just give me an idea about what you think summer ocean temperatures are going to look like, I would have probably drawn for you what 2020 is. So what did 2020 give us? Well, we had a pretty stormy July after a little bit drier of June. And, if you look at national yields at the end of that year, they weren't terrible. But of course, that was the year that we had the Iowa derecho, which of course, no one can predict that, months in advance, let alone the day of. Even sometimes that's hard. But that was the year of the big Iowa derecho. And we finished that year with 31 named tropical systems, which is the record for the most we've ever had in the Atlantic. And as you know, we've been worried about an active Atlantic hurricane season. So I'll just say this, it's a year that I can't ignore, and it's one that is starting to fit the picture a little bit better. And so folks always just want something to base things off of. And I would just say, keep an eye on 2020, knowing that there is no such thing as a perfect match. But if we're looking for the big climate drivers going into a growing season, maybe that's the year to look at.
What do you see for South America at this point?
Well, they've gone drier now in the forecast to finish out April on the safrinha crop. And remember, once we're done with April, we get into the end of the monsoon anyway. And so May is, looking like its normal start to the dry season down there, meaning that the safrinha crop, if any part of it's been jeopardized by some drought early, which I've heard stories out of Paraná and Mato Grosso do Sul of some rougher looking, more drought-stricken crop, that even despite some recent rains, we could start to see maybe some of those production numbers peel back a bit if the dryness really comes on as the models are saying. And we'll know about that, come June when harvest starts down there, but it's something to be watching right now so that maybe if we get a bit of good news out of South America in terms of our market behavior, we'll kind of be able to point back to a time period saying, hey, it was that mid to late April drier stretch that maybe tip the tide in the markets toward a more favorable price in spring.
Hey, thanks much.
Yeah, you bet.
Eric Snodgrass is with Nutrient Ag Solutions, and Daggerable joined us on this Friday edition of the Closing Market Report. It came to you from Illinois Public Media. It is public radio for the farming world, where you can find our daily programming to listen to on demand anytime you'd like. Just go to the website, willag.org, willag.org. There you'll also find a podcast tab. If you hit that, you'll find the players for the podcast RSS feed. The important part is each of those players have a subscribe button on them. If you hit that, you can find a way to subscribe to Apple and Spotify and many other applications right there directly on the website, or you can always just search it out in your own favorite podcast application on your phone and just look for the closing market report or Commodity Week for that matter. Speaking of Commodity Week, if you can stay with us for the whole of the hour, you'll hear all of Commodity Week. Otherwise, it's up online at willag.org or in the podcast applications already, and many of these radio stations will air it over the weekend.